Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be walking you guys through how I drew these lilies with oil pastels. I've been getting some comments on my TikTok asking about how I use oil pastels and kind of what my process is, and I thought this would be the perfect video to show you guys how to do that, because this is a very typical way of how I use my oil pastels and what I want the final piece to turn out like. So this shows my entire process of using oil pastels to create a piece that I want to create, and give you some tips as well. My style of using oil pastels is I love when you can see the brush strokes and when things aren't completely blended. I think that is the amazing thing about oil pastels, is that you can lay colors down so easily and you get this very painterly effect, which I love, and you can't really get that with many other mediums. So this is why I love oil pastels so much. I really hope you guys can learn something from this video and experiment with your oil pastels, and I hope you can get some tips from this and try them out with your pastels as well. So yeah, let's get right into it. I'll start with the materials that I'll be using. This is the sketchbook I chose to use just because for lighter colors, I noticed that it shows up a bit better, but I typically use this sketchbook, which is the Artist Loft Tree sketchbook, which has white paper. I suggest paper between 110 and 140 GSM or higher that has a pretty good tooth. I will say that this doesn't have the best tooth, so the blending and laying down the colors wasn't as easy as my other sketchbook, but it worked great for what I wanted. I'm going to be using a few oil pastel brands, the main one being my Mungyo Gallery Artist Soft Pastels. These are my favorite all-time pastels. Definitely recommend this package. You can do this whole piece with just one type of oil pastel and it'll turn out great. I just have a few more, so if you want to do some extra layering, I'll show you what I'm doing with that as well. Another brand I'll be using is this Paul Rubens set. Just a few colors from here, not too many. So this is definitely not really needed. And the last types of oil pastels I'll be using will be these Van Gogh ones. I absolutely love these for drafting up my works and for drawing out my base sketch, because they are much harder, more like a crayon, but still blend into the drawing really well. Another thing these are really good for is blending. Because of the hardness, they kind of just move the softer pastel on the page without having to blend with your fingers. I prefer blending with the pastels themselves rather than my fingers. I feel like I have a bit more control with that. These are amazing for that, so I would definitely recommend. I've also used this Faber-Castell Pit Pastel for initial drafts. It's just this really light gray that blends into the paper really well, but still gives me enough to see the outline that I want to do. Here are the colors that we're gonna be using today. So I found this reference picture on Pinterest, and these are how I chose my colors. First, white. This is my Mungyo white. As you can see, it's very well used. And then this is my finishing white, the Paul Rubens. Paul Rubens has a much softer texture, which is why I use them for the top layer. So I use the white Mungyo for the base layer, and then this is my finishing white. Next up is some baby yellow. This is the Van Gogh baby yellow that I use for drafting up my drawing. And then this is the Mungyo baby yellow. And then this is optional, but I just have a Paul Rubens baby yellow just for some final highlights, but this is completely optional. And those are the only two Paul Rubens oil pastels that I use in this drawing. Then you're gonna want a variety of greens. I'm using this light yellow type of green, just a light green, this kind of mossy green, and then this darker olive green. So these go from light to dark, and this is great to have a good range. for the flower petals, I use this peach, more for blending, this pink, and this darker pink. And then for shadows and the little stems in the flower, I use this ochre, this brown, and a gray, again from Van Gogh. So those are the colors we'll be using today. I also suggest having a piece of paper and paper towel with you so you can wipe off your pastels between use. So we're starting out here and I'm just drafting up the flower. When I have a reference picture, I keep it on my laptop and I have my laptop in front of me, so I reference it from there. Of course, with this, feel free to pick any type of reference photo you want and you can kind of follow these same steps as well. That way you can switch up any colors and choose the ones you really want to use. So after I've gone in with my Faber-Castell Pit Pastel, I'm working with the Van Gogh pastel. As I've said, these are really great for drawing up your initial sketch, and I choose the color that is most similar to the color that I'm going to be using my regular pastels with. So this baby yellow matched the reference photo because the greens can overlay on top of it, and the flower petals themselves I've noticed also had a bit of yellow. Next, I'm moving on to the first stem. So I'm starting with this baby yellow for the base, and then I start by layering the lighter green on top. I always like to start by layering the lightest color down first because I find that it keeps the highlight, whereas if you try to layer on top of darker colors, it can get muddy and doesn't sit as well on the page. So as you can see, I layered the lighter green on top and then the gray and then a bit of pink, and then I went back in and blended out with the baby yellow. And then I'm going in with my darker moss green to add the shadows. So I begin doing that same process for the second stem. For me, blending with oil pastels involves a lot of switching between the colors. So I'll put down the yellow and then I'll put down the lighter green on top. I'll blend again with the yellow and I'll blend again with the green. So this makes a more of a cohesive transition. And the color I start out with will vary. It's not always going to be baby yellow. It will be the lightest color that I think that area of the reference photo has. So as you can see, for that leaf, I thought the lightest color was light green. And then I layered the darker moss green on top. And then I layered the very dark green on top of that. So again, how I'm working is from the lightest to the darkest color, going back in each time I add a darker color over top of a lighter color to blend it back in. And you can see that I added in a bit of peach as well because I saw there was a hint of peach in the reference photo, and so I'll add that in and then again blend with the original color that I placed it on top of. Another thing about how I layer my oil pastels is I like the bottom layers to be more blended to get the background, and then as I work up, I'll leave more and more stroke-like marks until the final layer will be just of oil pastel that does not get blended at all. Next, I am moving on to the first flower, so you can see that I lightly laid down the yellow. This is the base color I would be using. I then laid down my white and put pink on top of that because I wanted the pink to be lighter. Then I went on and filled in the outside of the petals with my baby yellow, very slightly overlapping with the pink I just laid down. I then went and layered my white again on top where the two colors were overlapping and blended with my Van Gogh yellow. I went back in and darkened up that pink in the center and relayered the yellow on top of the outside of the petals to remove any of the paper showing through. I'm going back with my white to blend the pink and yellow together, and then I add some final strokes of the baby pink to act as the details. Now I'm going in with my lightest shade of green just around the edges of the petals and blending that back in with the baby yellow, and then I'm adding the stems on the inside of the flowers with the baby green and adding shadows to those stems with the darker green. I'm taking that brown to create those buds of the stems, and then we're taking the darkest shade of pink to create those darker shadows on the inside of the petals. And I slightly blended with an outward motion using that baby pink that I laid it on top of. Now I'm moving on to the next flower and following that same type of process, starting with the baby yellows and the pinks on the inside and the white. And it might vary from flower to flower, but the overall process is the same, and you can see that in the video here. Now you can choose to approach an art piece in a few different ways. Here I'm working section by section. I'm starting with the buds and then I'm moving from flower to flower down to the leaves at the bottom. And I'm doing each section to completion before moving on to the next. But another way I'll sometimes work is layer by layer. So I'll start with the lightest base layer and then do the next layer and then build up from there. So I'm kind of using the same color for the whole layer and then moving on to the next, etc., etc. It really depends on the piece you're working on and what you might prefer. Here with these types of drawings, I like to do each section to completion before moving on because it really helps me create a routine in the colors and the process I'll be using, especially if there happens to be repetitions of an object such as a flower or leaves. And when you're working section by section, I suggest going in the way that will provide the least amount of smudging on the page. So since I'm right-handed, I work from top left corner down to bottom right corner. But if you're left-handed, then you might want to work top right corner down to bottom left corner. And this just avoids your palm smudging any of the work that you've done. And you can see now I'm moving on to the next flower, which I've laid down the outline with the baby yellow and then gone in with my white and baby yellow in the middle and the outside of the petals, blending with the pink from the inside of the petals. And then I'll go back in with the white to blend and continue the process as you can see here. And so what I've learned after working with oil pastels is that you work layer by layer from the hardest pastels up until the softest pastels. On the bottom layer, you use the firmest pastels. This is because as you layer with softer pastels, they become more malleable on the page. So if you start with your softer pastels, it will fill up the tooth of the page a lot easier, and that doesn't allow you to layer many pastels on top of that because the texture of the page has already been filled. Whereas with firmer pastels, you can use a lighter stroke and not as much product will be put onto the page. But more importantly from that is if you lay down a soft pastel as your base layer and try to layer on top, all you're going to be doing is smudging around that softer pastel because it doesn't have as much stick to the paper. Especially if you try to layer a firmer pastel on top of this softer pastel, it's really just going to move it around and you really won't get that color to lay on top like you hoped. So that's why here you can see in my process I start with my Van Gogh pastels, which are the very hardest pastels. I move to my Mungyo pastels, which are softer, and I don't really touch my Paul Rubens pastels, which are the softest, until the end when I'm layering on top. So now as you can see, I've completed my layering and blending on the petals, and I'm going in and adding those details and stems to the inner part of the flower, as well as adding the shadows and blending it back out with the pink. And back to what I was saying before about layering harder pastels on top of softer pastels, that is actually what I use to my advantage when using my Van Gogh pastels to blend. Because they are such a firm pastel, they can blend the softer Mungyo pastels without leaving too much pigment on the page. And now we're moving on to the stems and the leaves. Here, I'm using around 5 colors: my baby yellow, my light green, my moss green, and my dark green. It is really important to have a really broad range of these colors when you're working with something like leaves because they all vary in lightness and darkness, and you want at least 3 shades to be on a singular leaf. That is what's going to give you the realism. So I'll start with a base shade and then layer another color on top to add that dimension, and then go in with the shadows with an even darker color, and then further enhance that contrast with my darkest shade. And then later I'll go in with my very lightest shade to add the highlights. So having around 5 shades like this allows you to have a variety to pick from for your base shade, whether it be a very light leaf or a darker leaf. And as you can see, I'm following the same process as I did with the buds at the beginning of this drawing, starting with my base shade, layering up with a darker shade, going back in with the lighter shade to blend it in, going back in with an even darker shade, back in with the medium shade, and you can see how I'm doing that here. So in general, I like to do at least 3 shades where one is lighter, one is medium, one is dark. That gives you that really good contrast and that really good depth, because that is really what's going to give you the realism and make your piece not look as flat. I really think that this contrast is key, and I find that it is what pulls my pieces completely together, especially when they say trust the process. In many of my pieces, I'll be a bit unsure, but then I'll go in and add these very dark shadows and very light highlights, and it just makes the piece pop, and it really brings it together. And don't be afraid to experiment with colors, even for your shadows. If you think that you see a little bit of a blue undertone, you could use a dark blue for your shadow, a dark purple for your shadow. Here I'm keeping it pretty standard. I'm just using my greens and my browns, but it is super fun to play around with colors and explore some outside of the box colors, because that's the thing about art, is you can create things that might not happen in real life. It makes it more visually interesting. One subject matter I really love to do that with is fish. Fish are a great subject matter for playing with color. You can add so many different pastel colors, so many different bold colors, use different undertones for shadows. It's great. What I did do for color here is I kind of changed the inner part of the flower to be more pink than orange, like what the reference photo showed. I just felt like playing with pinks, so that's what I chose to do. I'll also talk a bit here about what I use for inspiration for my art. As I mentioned, I got my reference photo from Pinterest. I love Pinterest so much for reference photos. I get so many of them from there. It's great because whatever I feel like drawing, I can just search up this certain type of flower, this certain type of fish, and it will just come up with a plethora of images for me to choose from. Or even if I search something more broadly, like plant, then I'll get inspiration based on the images of plants that they give me. And since it's more of an inspirational and artistic platform, it comes up with really nice photography and really nice reference photos that have good compositions and very pretty. So I'm working on the leaves still, and I'm doing the same process that I have explained of laying down colors and reblending with previous colors here. This reference photo has a lot of overlapping leaves. So here I'm working from the background to the foreground. It's easier to lay oil pastel down on top of another layer of oil pastel rather than trying to avoid the place of something that you drew in the foreground. This also goes for the way I did the flowers. I did the buds behind those first flowers, and then I did the background flowers, and then the main flower. But do keep in mind that when you're drawing the things in the background, you leave the space for the thing that is going to be laying over top of it, so just the edge lays over top of it, because if you do the whole thing in the background, then when you're trying to do the thing in the foreground, if you've already laid down a whole other subject matter, the tooth of the paper is full, so when you try to layer on top, you're really just going to end up smudging what's underneath and muddying your page. Now, this is not always the case, like how I did the leaf behind the flower. I did have to work around it, but working from background to foreground as a general rule of thumb is usually what I do to try and just make it easier on myself and not have to be so precise when avoiding something I've already drawn. Anyways, I think that's all the tips I have for now. I really want to make a whole video about my top art tips that have really helped me progress as an artist and that I continue to use today to help me when I'm making art, so that should be coming out in a video sometime soon. Here I'm just finishing up the leaves, and then I'll be back when we add the final highlights. So now we're just going to add the final highlights. I'm using my very soft pastels from Paul Rubens to just go over the edges of the petals to just redefine them. And then I'm going in with my white Paul Rubens pastel and adding the final white highlights on top of the petals. Paul Rubens sells this pack of 5 white pastels on Amazon for really cheap, and that's where I got this one from, not even from that big set, and I definitely recommend those. They are an amazing finishing white because of their creaminess and their texture, and they lay on top so easily, and I think a good white oil pastel like this really helps bring the whole piece together. I'm lastly going in with just that baby yellow again to add some highlights to the leaves. I'm using this baby yellow instead of white so it's not as stark of a contrast and it looks a bit more realistic. And after that, we are done. We have completed our oil pastel flowers. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you guys learned something from it and found it helpful to see and hear about my oil pastel process and some of my tips. I'm really happy I get to share this information with you guys. I hope this video inspired you guys to try out oil pastels, draw some flowers, or just do some art. Subscribe for more videos, and until next time, happy creating!